in musicology and medieval studies. He's taught at the Hart School and the University of Hartford, and he has written down retired underlined, I know the feeling. He was book review editor for Notes for a while. He's published in Jazz, Symphony Review, Journal of the Lute Society and Lute Society Quarterly, Good Old Notes, Early Music, Journal of the International Trumpet Guild, and he particularly said, I should mention his article in the journal Musical Analysis, and he will start us off. Monica, I hope we know.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk about Jerome Moross. Moross was, above all, I'd like to say that I'm going to read only in part a formal paper. The second half or so of this I'll make some informal comments and refer to the handout, and I hope you'll have time to listen to the entirety of the first movement of the symphony. Moross was, above all, a composer for the theater. He wrote songs and tunes infused with his affection for American subjects and for the universal themes of love, strife, tragedy, exhilaration, and above all, the joy of song and dance. It is somewhat ironic, then, that major influences on his work and much of the music he held in highest regard seem to have had little to do with popular song or musical theater per se. Initially in his youth, Moross wrote in a dissonant modernistic style, but it was not long before he began to mix a more conservative and tonal approach with jazz, popular, and folk idioms he experienced in everyday life and played as a young man in nightclubs and pit orchestras as a gigging New York musician. The disparate influences on him as a young composer include Schoenberg, George Gershwin, Henry Cowell, George Antheil, and Aaron Copland, but especially popular music in general, jazz and blues. Moross was a modest and not particularly entrepreneurial figure, not full of praise for himself, but interested unusually in music of other composers, particularly Charles Ives, who was relatively unknown at that time in New York, and the 19th century American composer and pianist Louis Moreau Gottschalk. Might point out that it might have been profitable for Moross to continue his interest in Gottschalk, because much later his colleague Hershey Kay wrote a ballet based on Gottschalk called Cakewalk, which was eventually choreographed by Georges Balanchine and figured very prominently in the Gottschalk revival of the 60s and 70s. Moross revered classical masters, studied forms. He graduated, by the way, at the age of 18 with his bachelor's degree in music. He particularly used himself ternary forms, rondo, and variation technique. He was capable of writing extended developments of thematic material, but it was not his specialty. He often crafted quite beautiful counterpoint, but not in general rigorous in the manner of classical fugues. Moross was an intellectual person and an intellectual composer, and probably gave his listener credit for being discerning and having an educated musical background. Many such examples abound, but for one that comes to mind immediately, one is not sure how many lovers of musical theater would be as intimately familiar with Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey as he himself was. I could also add, as an aside, I just discovered quite recently one of his ballet ballads has a quite unusual title which always intrigued me. It was called The Eccentricities of Davy Crockett. And as it turns out, Moross, even there, was using a literary allusion to the very first published biography of Davy Crockett, which was called The Eccentricities of the Frontiersman David Crockett of Kentucky. One of Moross's contributions to American music was a small body of concert music for orchestra that incorporates techniques considerably more sophisticated than the overtly popular music of melodic writing. He was not a composer of large-scale or monumental works, but miniatures. He was suited by temperament to songs, ballets, and suites, that is to say, program music, not lengthy abstract symphonies in the European tradition. This had already been done quite brilliantly, as most of you all know, by people like John Knowles Paine and George Chadwick in the 18th century, and among his own contemporaries by such figures as Walter Piston and David Diamond. As is true with other composers as well, many listeners of Moross who enjoy the purely melodic quality of his writing do not necessarily grasp the technical details he employs. A very good example of this is the first movement of his single symphony, which we will look at briefly and talk about. Characteristics of Moross's music in general include syncopation, gapped scales, often pentatonic, possibly showing the influence of folk song, blue notes, modal harmony, melodic sequence, a pronounced symmetry of phrasing, rhythmic ostinato, occasional dissonance, even bitonality, and a tendency to use short rhythmic motives, some taken from his own themes, and some derived from dances such as the Charleston, ragtime, polka, foxtrot, schottisch, and cakewalk. Despite his early and thorough musical training and his involvement with Copeland's Young Composers Group, Moross really never studied composition formally for an extended period with a private teacher, but developed an approach which was personal, idiosyncratic, and essentially self-taught. The young composers active in New York City primarily in the 1930s and 40s are often considered and evaluated as a group, yet this was a very bright galaxy, and there were several lesser stars, of whom Moross is certainly one, whose substantial legacy awaits rediscovery. If I could ask you to turn to your handout, we could talk briefly about the symphony. Actually, even before that, let me just mention a very few comments about its origin, which are very fascinating. The composer's manuscript of the symphony, which actually you can see part of it on the last page of the handout, he had a very attractive musical hand, I must say. Probably, in my experience, second only to Walter Piston, who, after all, was a draftsman by trade. Very beautiful script. Moross did not use key signatures, as a rule, so I've transposed some of these themes to a diatonic white key scale. The composer's autograph says January 1940 to February 1942, but its origins actually go back to 1938. In this year, CBS commissioned a number of composers, including Moross, to provide orchestral arrangements of American folk songs. Other composers who were commissioned were Henry Brandt, Ruth Crawford Seeger, Ross Lee Finney, Roy Harris, William Grant Still, and Aaron Copland. These arrangements were intended for broadcast on the radio program American School of the Air, Folk Music of America, aimed at young audiences. The subject of Moross's arrangement was the folk song Midnight Special, which was suggested to him by folklorist John Lomax. Moross's setting was originally entitled Ramble on a Hobo Tune. The folk song is treated extremely subtly. It is hardly discernible to the ear. I'm not really sure if this is exactly what the commissioners of these works wanted. But it's a very refined artistic treatment in which, if one listens very carefully for the tune Midnight Special, it's discernible in the violas and cellos very, very faintly. It's a sublimely artistic setting of inspired by that melody. Looking now at our handout, if you would, I've given on pages 2 and 3 a summary of Moross's works for orchestra, listing in bold type those titles specifically, which are concert music for orchestral performance. And you can see the concentration of them in the 1930s. Many of these, unfortunately, are lost. And the symphony we're going to deal with now from 1942 is one completed symphony, although he did work on a second symphony. It was never completed. Sketches of it exist and are ripe for someone to study. It's a jazz-influenced work. It was never actually performed that I know of and not completed. So we have the one symphony in 42, jumping way over to the next page, an original work for orchestra next, 1953, an extremely fine work in variation form called The Last Judgment. And then it's now 58 and 65 when we get to the bold-faced titles. These are arrangements that Moross himself made of as concert suites for music that he had written for films. I personally have had the pleasure of seeing both of these suites played live by an orchestra, and it is really quite a wonderful musical experience. If you look at the next page, page 4, the Symphony of Moross is quite extraordinary. Well, actually, I guess if you would look instead next at page 5, I've given you a synopsis of the form, which is in variation form. It's not in a traditional approach to variation to put it to understate it, it's a group of variations derived from two different themes. On page 4 of your handout, the first theme is a fanfare-like passage starting on B, bum, ba-da-dum, bum, and initially your thought may be that this is a piece in perhaps B major, followed by a flourish of 16th notes, which suggests otherwise, and sounds immediately to the ear, at least to mine, like you're either dealing with B major or rather B Lydian scale with a raised F, raised E sharp rather, or simply an F sharp major scale. I've bracketed, as you can see, the extraordinary juxtaposition of major triads, which B major triad up to and then G sharp, coming down G sharp, E sharp, C sharp, and then the jump over to C sharp, A sharp, F sharp. We get a wonderful confluence of triads, but a very interesting set of dissonances, do we not? B to E sharp, a prominent tritone, and a wonderful the seventh outlined in the last 4 notes. Da, da, E sharp, F sharp to E sharp. The notes above that, in example 1, I've kind of bracketed. The upper bracket lists the notes of the first motive, B, D sharp, F sharp, G. And then the lower set of brackets show the notes figuring into motive 2, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, E sharp, and only D sharp remains common to those. Oh, actually, F sharp as well, doesn't it? If you transpose it up a half step, you can get a white key scale, as I've shown you, starting on G with simply a raised F sharp. The overall design of the symphony shown at the bottom of the page is most unusual. You have the theme and variations as the first movement, a sonata scherzo as a second, the original movement called Ramble on a Hobo Tune as the third, and then concluding with a short fugue in C major. The proportions of these pieces and the relative durations of them I've given you. These times are from the Joanne Folletta recording, of course. The sonata scherzo is the more lengthy of them, and it features very prominently a virtuoso piano part. One interesting sidelight is that in one of the early performances of this piece, conducted by Alfred Wallenstein, the pianist who had been playing this piece was, according to the program, indisposed. She was actually having a baby at the time, and Moross substituted at the last minute to play the very difficult piano part of this own piece. The relationships of these movements are interesting also tonally. I have made a mistake on the handout where it says theme and variations. That actually should say F sharp major, as we will hear. And the relationship between F sharp and C major at the end gives us a tritone relationship. We also get between movements 2 and 3 an interesting E flat to E minor relationship. The third movement, this very slow and poignant ramble on a hobo tune, ends on the dominant of E minor, which is a long piano, pianissimo sustained B natural, leading nicely to, as a leading tone into the final movement in C major. So it has a very intricate and subtle, very unusual set of harmonic relationships. What I'd like to do now is simply play the piece, and the analysis on page 5 is not so much a detailed harmonic analysis as simply a listener's guide. And with your permission, I'll simply say quietly variation 1, variation 2. I've actually given variation 9 as well. Moross lists only 8 variations of his own. Probably a scribal error, I would think. I hear very distinctly 9 variations and a coda at the end. I'd like to point out that some very brilliant and unusual and very sophisticated things go on here, which evade repeated listening, even my own, I must say. The last 4 notes we're going to hear, you will recognize as being the last 4 notes of the second motive that spelled out major 7th. Ba, ba, ba. We'll also hear in a very beautiful and skillful and artistic way at variation 9, the second theme in traditional fugal style augmentation, high above the orchestra as the rest of the players, high in the violins as the rest of the orchestra are dealing with the first 2 motives from the opening theme. Really an extraordinary piece. Hope you'll agree. This is the first movement of the Moross Symphony. Starting it. This is theme 2. Variation 1. Variation 2. Variation 3. Variation 4. Variation 5. Variation 6. Variation 7. Variation 8. Variation 9. This is the beautiful coda. I think I'm out of time. Thank you for your attention.